The sky turned wrong. It happened fast, the way death does in West Texas. One moment, the afternoon sun was burning down on the cattle pens outside Hereford, casting long shadows across the dust. The next, the horizon swallowed itself. A wall rose in the distance, brown and black, rolling forward like something alive. It stretched from earth to heaven, devouring everything in its path. Johann Müller saw it first. He dropped the fence post he'd been hammering and straightened slowly, his back aching from hours of labor. The young German prisoner squinted at the approaching darkness, his mouth going dry. He'd seen many things in this war: tank fire in North Africa, bombing raids over Sicily, the inside of a cargo ship crossing the Atlantic, but he'd never seen the land itself rise up and march forward. "Storm," he said quietly in broken English, pointing. The cowboy nearest him, a man named Ray Calhoun, turned and went pale. Ray had lived in the Texas Panhandle all his 43 years. He knew what that wall meant. He'd survived the Dust Bowl storms of the 1930s, the black blizzards that turned day into night and buried farmhouses to their roofs. This one looked just as bad, maybe worse. "Jesus Christ," Ray breathed, then louder, shouting now, "Everyone to the house, now, leave the tools." 12 German prisoners and 4 cowboys looked up from their work scattered across the ranch. For a split second, no one moved. Then the guards, 2 young soldiers barely out of basic training, began shouting orders. The prisoners needed no translation. They could see the monster coming. Cattle began to low in panic, pressing against the fence rails. Birds that had been pecking in the dirt took flight all at once, a black cloud of wings fleeing south. The air itself changed, turning thick and copper-tasting, electric with something that made the hair stand up on every man's arms. They ran. The ranch house sat a quarter-mile from the pens, a low wooden structure built to withstand wind, but never meant to hold this many bodies. Johann ran alongside a cowboy he'd worked with for weeks, but whose name he still didn't know. Their boots pounded the hard earth in rhythm. Behind them, the wall grew taller, blotting out the sun degree by degree. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in 30 seconds. The wind hit next, not a breeze, but a solid force that nearly knocked men off their feet. Dust began to swirl around their ankles, then their knees, then their waists. Visibility collapsed. The ranch house, so clear a moment ago, became a ghost in the gathering darkness. "Keep moving," Ray shouted, though his voice was already being torn away by the wind. "Follow the fence line." Johann grabbed the shoulder of the man in front of him and felt someone grab his. They formed a chain, prisoners and cowboys and guards, stumbling blind through a world that had gone mad. The dust filled Johann's nose, his mouth, his eyes. He couldn't breathe without choking. Each step became an act of faith. The porch appeared suddenly, materializing from the brown fog like salvation. Hands reached out, pulling men up the steps. Ray was there, counting heads as bodies stumbled through the door. 12, 13, 14, he counted aloud. "Where's Curtis? Anyone see Curtis?" A cowboy named Dale pushed back toward the door. "I'll get him," but Ray grabbed his arm. "Too late, look." The storm hit the ranch house like a freight train. The entire structure shuddered. Dust poured through every crack, every gap, every space between boards. The windows went dark, not gradually but all at once, as if someone had thrown a blanket over the world. Men coughed and covered their faces. The roar was deafening, a sound like the end of everything. Then, through the howling wind, they heard it, pounding on the door. Ray threw it open and Curtis fell through, covered head to toe in dust, gasping like a drowning man. They slammed the door shut again, but not before a wave of dirt swept inside, coating everything, everyone. For a long moment, no one spoke. They simply stood in the darkness, listening to the storm tear at the walls, feeling the house shake on its foundation. Someone found a lantern. The match flared, impossibly bright in the gloom, and the wick caught. In the flickering light, 17 men looked at each other. Cowboys and German prisoners, Americans and enemies, all of them trapped together with no idea how long the storm would last. Johann felt his heart pounding. He'd expected many things when he was captured. Imprisonment, yes. Hard labor, certainly. Perhaps even death. But he'd never expected this, to be locked in a small wooden house with the men who'd defeated his army, waiting for a wall of dust to bury them all. Ray Calhoun surveyed the crowded room and made a decision. "All right, he said, his voice steady despite everything. "We're going to be here a while. Might be hours, might be longer. We've got water in the kitchen, some food if we're smart about it. Anyone hurt?" The men shook their heads, still too stunned to speak much. Dust covered everything, a fine brown powder that clung to skin and clothes and hair. It hung in the air, visible in the lantern light, swirling like snow. One of the guards, a kid named Private Henderson from Oklahoma, cleared his throat nervously. "Sir, what about protocol? Should we separate the prisoners?" Ray looked around the single room, then back at Henderson. "Son, you see anywhere to separate them to?" Henderson fell silent. The ranch house had been built as a workstation, not a barracks. One main room with a kitchen area, a small back room for supplies, and that was it. 17 men packed into maybe 800 square feet of space. Outside, the storm screamed. Dust continued to seep through invisible cracks, creating small piles on the windowsills and floor. The sound was relentless, a constant battering that felt almost alive in its fury. This wasn't just wind and dust. This was the land itself rising up in rage. Johann found a spot against the wall and slid down to sit. His uniform, already faded from weeks of ranch work, was now the same brown as everything else. Across from him, a cowboy did the same. Their eyes met briefly, then looked away. What do you say to your enemy when nature has decided to kill you both equally? The historical record shows that by 1944, Texas held more than 50,000 German prisoners of war, scattered across dozens of camps from El Paso to Houston. But the camps themselves were just the beginning. The real work happened on remote ranches and farms, where labor was desperately needed and prisoners were cheap. The war had taken millions of American men overseas, leaving fields unharvested and cattle untended. German POWs filled that gap. These work details operated in a strange gray zone. Yes, the prisoners were still captives, still enemies, but out on the ranches, far from the barbed wire and guard towers, the lines blurred. Cowboys needed help, prisoners needed work, and so they labored side by side, mending fences and driving cattle under the vast Texas sky. The arrangement was practical, not sentimental, but practicality created something unexpected. When you work alongside a man for 10 hours under a burning sun, when you share water from the same canteen and curse the same stubborn steer, the propaganda begins to crack. The German prisoners learned that American cowboys weren't the weak, decadent fools they'd been told about. The cowboys learned that German soldiers weren't all fanatical monsters. They were just men, mostly young, mostly scared, mostly homesick. Still, there were boundaries. Guards, even young and inexperienced ones, maintained order. Prisoners slept in separate barracks or trucks. Conversations stayed surface level, limited by language barriers and wariness. Trust only went so far when your countries were still killing each other across the ocean. The dust storms of the 1940s were a cruel inheritance from the previous decade. The Dust Bowl of the 1930s had ravaged the Great Plains, turning millions of acres into wasteland. By the war years, things had improved slightly. Farmers had learned new techniques, planted windbreaks, changed their plowing methods. But the dust hadn't gone away. It never really went away in West Texas. It just waited for the right conditions to rise again. When storms did come, they came with apocalyptic force. Walls of dust a mile high, moving at 50 miles per hour, carrying millions of tons of topsoil ripped from fields and prairies. These weren't simple windstorms. They were geological events, the earth reshaping itself in real time. And for anyone caught outside, they were deadly. Remote ranches were especially vulnerable. Miles from town, connected only by dirt roads that vanished in minutes under drifting dust, they became islands in a brown sea. Communication was impossible. Radio signals died. Telephone lines, if they existed at all, went dead as poles toppled. When a storm hit, you were alone. The ranchers knew this. They'd built their homes accordingly, low and solid, designed to hunker down and endure. Shutters over windows, heavy doors, storm cellars when possible. But nobody built for 17 people. The work crews were only supposed to be out for the day, back to the main camp by sunset. The storm had other plans. Inside the ranch house, the initial shock began to wear off. Men found places to sit or lean. The guards stayed near the door, rifles still in hand, though no one was going anywhere. The prisoners clustered in one corner, the cowboys in another, an invisible line dividing the room that no one had to draw. Ray Calhoun moved to the kitchen area and returned with a tin of water. "We'll need to ration this," he said. "Storm could last hours or days, hard to tell." He took a small sip and passed it to the next man. "Everyone gets a drink. We're all in this together." The tin made its way around the room, cowboy to guard to prisoner and back again. When it reached Johann, he hesitated, then drank. The water was warm and tasted of metal, but it washed some of the dust from his throat. He passed it to the next prisoner, an older man named Klaus, who'd been a farmer in Bavaria before the war. Klaus drank and nodded his thanks to Ray. "Danke," he said softly. "Thank you." Ray nodded back, the gesture simple but significant. In that moment, the math of survival began to override the math of war. They were 17 men with limited water, limited food, and a storm outside that didn't care which uniform anyone wore. Time began to stretch. With no visibility outside and nothing to do, minutes felt like hours. The lantern light flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Dust continued to infiltrate every surface, coating skin and clothes with a gritty film that no amount of brushing could remove. Men coughed, spat brown, and tried not to think about how much dirt they were breathing. The storm showed no signs of weakening. If anything, it grew stronger. The house creaked and groaned under the assault. Wind found new gaps to exploit, whistling through cracks with an eerie, almost musical sound. Somewhere outside, something metal was banging against something wooden, a steady rhythm that made everyone's nerves tighter. Johann watched the cowboys, trying to read their faces. Were they angry about being trapped with enemy prisoners? Afraid? He couldn't tell. The Americans wore expressions of grim acceptance, the look of men who'd weathered storms before and knew that patience was the only weapon against nature's fury. One of the younger cowboys, barely 20, kept glancing at the door as if expecting it to burst open. Dale, the older hand who'd almost gone back out for Curtis, sat whittling a piece of wood he'd pulled from his pocket, his knife moving in small, precise strokes. Curtis himself sat against the far wall, still catching his breath, dust caked in his hair and beard. The guards looked the most uncomfortable. Henderson and the other one, Private Martinez, were city boys from Oklahoma City and San Antonio, respectively. They'd joined the army expecting to fight, or at least to guard prisoners behind proper fences. Instead, they'd been assigned to ranch duty, babysitting work details in the middle of nowhere. Now they sat with rifles across their laps, uncertain whether their authority meant anything in a room where everyone was equally trapped. As the first hour passed, then the second, the reality settled in. This wasn't going to be quick. The storm had them, and it would release them when it decided, not before. Men shifted positions, trying to find comfort on the hard floor. Someone's stomach growled loudly in the silence between wind gusts. A few men pulled out tobacco and rolled cigarettes, the familiar ritual offering something to do with restless hands. Ray checked his watch by the lantern light. "Coming up on 4 hours since it hit," he announced to no one in particular. "Sun'll be down in another 2, though you'd never know it." Outside, the world had become a uniform brown darkness. Day and night had lost all meaning. The storm was everything, the only reality, a force so overwhelming that human concerns seemed absurdly small by comparison. Johann leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes. He thought about how he'd gotten here, the long chain of events that had led from his village in Saxony to a ranch house in Texas, trapped in a dust storm with cowboys who spoke a language he barely understood. The war seemed very far away. So did home. Everything seemed far away except the 17 men breathing dust in this small wooden box, waiting for nature to remember mercy. And in that waiting, in that forced stillness, something began to shift. The barriers were still there, yes, visible and real, but they were starting to feel arbitrary, man-made constructs in the face of something much larger and more ancient than any war. The storm raged on, and 17 men, enemies by law and circumstance, began the strange journey of discovering they might be something else as well. human. The word hung in Johann's mind as the hours dragged on. That's what they all were, stripped down to the most basic fact. Not soldiers or prisoners, not Americans or Germans, just humans packed into a space meant for maybe 6 people, breathing the same dusty air, listening to the same wind trying to tear the walls apart. But knowing something and feeling it are different things entirely. By the time true darkness fell outside, though no one could really tell since the storm had blackened the sky hours earlier, the tension in the room had become almost solid. You could feel it in the way men held themselves, shoulders tight, jaws clenched. In the careful space each person maintained, the invisible bubble of distrust and uncertainty. In the silence that fell between the gusts of wind, heavy with things no one knew how to say, the single lantern threw shadows that seemed to deepen the divide. Cowboys on one side, prisoners on the other, guards in the middle like a no-man's land. Every so often, someone would shift position and everyone else would tense slightly, watching to see what the movement meant. Ray Calhoun felt the pressure building. He'd been ranching long enough to know that men cooped up too long became dangerous, even good men. Add in language barriers, enemy status, and the fundamental strangeness of the situation, and you had a powder keg. The storm outside was deadly, sure, but the real danger might be inside this room if something didn't change. The water tin made another round, the supply visibly lower now. Ray did the math in his head and didn't like the answer. They had maybe 2 days of water if they were careful, less if the storm kept the heat up. Food was even worse. Some jerky, a loaf of bread gone stale, half a tin of beans, enough for one decent meal for 17 men, but spread across days it meant everyone stayed hungry. Klaus, the older German prisoner, began coughing, a deep rattling sound that came from breathing too much dust. Several other men were coughing too, their lungs trying desperately to expel the fine particles that kept working their way in. Someone would need to hang wet cloths over the cracks in the walls, but that meant using precious water. Private Henderson shifted his rifle for the 12th time, the movement purely nervous. Martinez whispered something to him, too quiet for anyone else to hear. The guards were scared, Johann realized. They were barely older than he was, maybe 21 or 22, and they'd been trained for a war with clear rules. Guard the prisoners, maintain order, report to superiors. But there were no superiors here, no rulebook for being trapped in a dust storm, no protocol for when nature decided everyone was equal. Curtis, the cowboy who'd nearly been left outside, suddenly stood up. The movement made everyone jump slightly. He walked to the kitchen area, his boots loud in the tense silence, and returned with something wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it slowly, revealing a half-wheel of cheese, yellow and hard. "Found this in the back," Curtis said, his voice rough from dust. "Wasn't supposed to be here, but I ain't sorry about it now." He pulled out his knife and began cutting thin slices. "Figure we all need something in our bellies." He handed the first slice to the prisoner nearest him, a young man who looked startled to be offered food by an American. The German took it hesitantly, as if expecting a trick. When none came, he nodded thanks and ate. Curtis continued cutting and passing slices around the room, to cowboys and prisoners alike, until the cheese was gone. It was a small thing, a few ounces of food that barely registered in hungry stomachs. But it was something, an acknowledgement that the storm outside didn't care about politics, so maybe, for these few hours or days, they shouldn't either. Dale, the cowboy who'd been whittling earlier, pulled out his tobacco pouch and began rolling a cigarette. He glanced at the German sitting nearest him, a thin man with a scar across his cheek, and held out the pouch in offering. The German's eyes widened slightly. Tobacco was worth gold in the camps. Prisoners were issued some, but never enough. To be offered it freely by an American cowboy was unexpected. "Danke," the German said again, that word that was becoming a bridge. He took the pouch carefully, rolled his own cigarette with practiced hands, and passed it back. Dale lit both cigarettes with the same match. They smoked in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now, shared instead of separate. The smell of tobacco smoke mixed with dust and sweat and the mustiness of the old house. It should have been unpleasant, but instead, it was almost comforting. The smell of men making do, finding small comforts in a bad situation. Still, the tension remained. Men watched each other with guarded eyes. The cultural divide was vast, made worse by the language barrier. Johann knew maybe 50 words of English, most of them related to ranch work, fence, cattle, water, hammer. The Cowboys knew no German at all. Communication happened in gestures and single words, misunderstandings frequent and frustrating. More than that, there was history between them. These American cowboys probably had sons or brothers or friends fighting overseas, fighting Germans. The prisoners had seen their comrades killed by American bombs and bullets. The war wasn't some distant abstract thing. It was personal, carved into memory with grief and loss. Johann caught one cowboy staring at him with something that might have been hatred or might have been simple curiosity. It was impossible to tell. The cowboy looked away when their eyes met, but the moment left Johann's chest tight. They might share a room and water and cheese, but that didn't erase what they were to each other. The storm continued its assault. Hours 6, 7, 8. The initial adrenaline had long since faded, replaced by a grinding weariness. Men dozed fitfully, heads nodding forward, then jerking back awake. Others simply stared at nothing, lost in thoughts of home or fear or the surreal nature of it all. Then Ray Calhoun did something unexpected. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a deck of cards, so worn the edges were soft and the backs had faded from red to pink. He shuffled them once, the familiar sound cutting through the wind noise, and looked around the room. "Anyone play poker?" Ray asked. For a moment, no one responded. The question seemed absurd given the circumstances. They were trapped in a dust storm that might bury them, rationing water and facing an unknown number of days together. And this cowboy wanted to play cards? But then Dale grinned, the expression cracking through the tension like sunlight through clouds. "Hell, Ray, you trying to clean me out again?" "Just trying to pass the time," Ray said. "Seems to me we got plenty of that and not much to do with it." Curtis nodded slowly. "I'm in." The young cowboy who'd been nervous earlier, a kid named Tommy, scooted closer. "Deal me in too." Ray looked at the German prisoners, his eyes questioning. "Any of you boys know cards?" The language barrier made the question difficult, but the deck in Ray's hands made the meaning clear. Klaus, the older farmer from Bavaria, straightened up. "Ja," he said, then struggled for the English word. "Yes, cards, I play." Another prisoner, a man named Werner, who'd been a mechanic in Hamburg before the war, nodded eagerly. "Poker," he said with a thick accent. "I know poker." Johann felt his heart beat faster. This was dangerous territory. Fraternization between prisoners and Americans beyond what work required was officially discouraged. The guards might object. And yet, the idea of doing something, anything, besides sitting in tense silence was deeply appealing. Private Henderson started to stand, to object, but Martinez put a hand on his arm. "Let them," Martinez said quietly. "What's it going to hurt? We're all stuck here anyway." Henderson hesitated, then settled back down. He kept his rifle close, but he didn't stop them. Ray cleared a space on the floor and began dealing. The cards whispered as they fell, 5 to each player in the first hand. Cowboys and Germans sat in a rough circle, knees nearly touching in the crowded space. The lantern was moved to the center, casting light on the makeshift table. 5 card draw, Ray announced. Nothing wild. He looked at the Germans. "You understand? 5 cards?" Klaus held up his hand, all 5 fingers spread, and nodded. 5. 5. The first hand was awkward. Werner didn't understand when to bet, and Tommy had to show him by gesture, pointing at the pile of matchsticks they were using for chips, then at his cards, then at the pile again. Klaus folded immediately, perhaps not understanding the game was actually competitive. But the round finished. Dale won with a pair of jacks, and they dealt again. The second hand went smoother, the third smoother still. By the fourth, something remarkable was happening. The stiffness was leaving shoulders, small smiles appeared. When Werner won a hand with 3 tens, he let out a whoop of delight that made everyone jump, then laugh at the absurdity of celebrating cards while a storm tried to kill them. Ray pulled out a small bottle of whiskey from somewhere, took a swig, and passed it around the circle. Cowboys and Germans alike drank, the bottle making the rounds without hesitation. The alcohol burned, but it also warmed, and it loosened tongues. "Where you from?" Dale asked Klaus, using simple words and hand gestures. "You're home." Klaus thought for a moment, then pointed at himself. "Bavaria. Farm. He made a gesture like milking a cow, and Dale laughed in recognition. You a farmer too, like me? Dale pointed at himself, then made the same milking gesture. Yeah, yes. Klaus's face lit up. Here was common ground, something that transcended nationality. Cows, wheat, farm. Curtis leaned forward. How many cows? Klaus held up both hands twice. 20. The Cowboys whistled softly. 20 cows was a small operation, but respectable for German farms they'd heard about. Dale held up his hands over and over, eventually getting across that his family's ranch ran about 500 head. Klaus's eyes went wide, unable to imagine that many cattle. The card game continued, but it had become secondary to something more important. Communication. The barriers were still there, but men were finding ways around them, over them, through them. Poker hands became excuses for conversation. Betting became an opportunity to share tobacco or matches or sips of whiskey. Johann found himself dealing a hand, his fingers remembering the shuffle his father had taught him years ago. He'd played cards in beer halls in Leipzig, in trenches in Tunisia, in the cargo hold of the ship that brought him to America. Cards were universal, a language that needed no translation. You won or lost, bluffed or folded, and everyone understood. Tommy asked Johann through gestures and simple words how he'd been captured. Johann tried to explain, his English failing him. He resorted to sounds and movements, imitating aircraft, explosions, surrender. It must have looked absurd, but Tommy nodded in understanding. He pointed at himself, then made a gesture like holding binoculars. Guard, he said, I watch. He seemed almost apologetic about it. Werner discovered he could make the others laugh by doing impressions. He imitated one guard's walk, then Ray's way of shuffling cards, then the sound of Curtis's coughing. It was gentle mockery, nothing mean, and it transformed the room. Laughter, real laughter, filled the space where tension had been. The guards watched all this with expressions somewhere between disapproval and relief. Henderson still looked uncomfortable, but Martinez had relaxed considerably. At one point, Martinez even joined the game, sitting down in the circle and accepting cards like it was the most natural thing in the world. Outside, the storm showed no signs of stopping. The wind continued to howl, dust continued to seep in, and the darkness remained absolute. But inside, something had shifted fundamentally. The room that had felt like a prison had become, improbably, almost companionable. Ray won a big hand with a full house and did a little victory gesture that made everyone groan. Klaus lost consistently but seemed to be enjoying himself anyway, laughing at his own bad luck. Dale and Werner struck up a strange friendship, communicating mostly through gestures and single words, but understanding each other nonetheless. Food appeared from unexpected places. Someone had peppermints in their pocket. Another had beef jerky. Curtis produced a small tin of sardines that he swore he'd forgotten about. Everything was shared, passed around the circle of card players without thought for who was American and who was German. Hours passed, though no one was counting anymore. The card game broke up and reformed with different players. Johann taught some of the Cowboys a German game called Skat, which proved too complicated for most but earned him respect for trying. Tommy tried to teach everyone Texas Hold'em, but the rules got lost in translation and dissolved into laughter. At some point deep in the first night, Dale pulled out a harmonica and played a soft tune, something lonesome and sweet. Klaus began humming along, the melody apparently familiar from German folk music. Werner knew some of the words and sang them softly in German. It should have been strange, enemy soldiers singing together while trapped in a dust storm. But somehow, in that moment, it was exactly right. The guards didn't stop them. Henderson had finally set his rifle aside, accepting that no one was going anywhere, that the rules were different here. Martinez was actually smiling, tapping his foot to the harmonica music. Ray Calhoun looked around the room at Cowboys and Germans sitting together, sharing cards and tobacco and songs, and felt something tight in his chest loosen. He'd been afraid this situation would end badly, that proximity would breed conflict. Instead, cards and time and shared misery had done something he wouldn't have thought possible 24 hours ago. They'd reminded everyone in that room of their humanity. The storm raged on, But inside the ranch house, 17 men had found something stronger than walls to shelter behind. They'd found connection, fragile and unexpected, built on nothing more substantial than playing cards and shared whiskey and the simple recognition that fear and hunger and hope feel the same in any language. The first night passed that way, cards on the floor and music in the air, enemies becoming something else, something harder to define. And when men finally dozed off in the early hours, some leaning against walls and others sprawled on the floor, they slept closer together than they would have before. The invisible lines had blurred, not erased entirely, but softer now, less important than getting through this together. The second morning, if it could be called morning, arrived without any real change in the light. The storm outside continued its relentless assault, the world beyond the walls still lost in brown darkness. Men woke stiff and sore from sleeping on hard floors, mouths dry and gritty with dust. But something had changed overnight. The way bodies had arranged themselves in sleep told the story. Cowboys and Germans mixed together now, the careful separation of the first hours forgotten. Johann opened his eyes, to find himself lying near Dale, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. On his other side, Werner snored softly, his face peaceful in sleep despite everything. Across the room, Ray was already awake, checking their water supply by the dim lantern light. His expression was grim. "We need to be smarter about this," Ray said quietly, though his voice still woke several men. "Water's getting low, food too." Curtis sat up, running a hand through his dust-caked hair. "How long you figure the storm's got left?" Ray shook his head. "Could be hours, could be another 2 days. These big ones, they settle in and stay." Klaus struggled to his feet, his joints cracking audibly. At 53, he was the oldest man in the room, and the hard floor had not been kind. He moved to the window and peered out through a crack in the shutter, though there was nothing to see but swirling brown darkness. "No good," he said simply. The inventory was sobering. Less than half their water remained. The food was down to a handful of jerky strips, some stale crackers someone had found in a drawer, and the sardines Curtis had been saving. If they stretched it carefully, they might make it through one more day. After that, hunger would become a real problem. But as the men gathered around the lantern, something unexpected happened. Instead of despair settling in, a strange determination took hold. They'd made it through one night together. They could make it through another day. "Deal the cards," Tommy said, grinning despite his hollow stomach. "We got us a tournament to finish." The second day's card games took on a different character. With less tension and more familiarity, the competition became genuine. Cowboys and Germans alike wanted to win, not just pass time. They played for matches and buttons and small personal items, the stakes meaningless but somehow important anyway. Werner turned out to be a card sharp, his mechanic's hands quick and precise. He won 3 hands in a row, his pile of matches growing until Dale accused him of cheating. But it was good-natured, accompanied by laughter. Werner demonstrated a card trick he'd learned before the war, making an ace disappear and reappear behind Tommy's ear. The young cowboy's delighted surprise made everyone laugh. "Teach me that," Tommy insisted, and Werner did, patiently showing him the sleight of hand over and over until Tommy could almost manage it. The sight of an American cowboy and a German prisoner hunched over a deck of cards, one teaching the other magic tricks while a dust storm raged outside, would have seemed impossible just days before. Ray discovered that Klaus knew a card game called Doppelkopf that required 4 players and was apparently popular in Bavaria. The rules were complex, involving partnerships that changed each hand, and a scoring system that took 3 explanations before anyone understood. They played it anyway, making mistakes and arguing about rules they couldn't properly communicate, but enjoying themselves thoroughly. Around midday, though time had become almost meaningless, Curtis suggested they share what little food remained. "Better to eat now and keep our strength," he reasoned. "Won't do us any good if we're too weak to move when this storm breaks." They divided everything into 17 equal portions, pitifully small but shared with absolute fairness. Johann received 3 crackers, 1 thin strip of jerky, and 2 sardines. He ate slowly, making each bite last, aware that this might be all he'd get for many hours. Martinez produced a surprise, a small paper bag of hard candies he'd been carrying. "My mama gave me these when I shipped out," he said, his voice carrying emotion. Figured I might need them someday. Guess today's that day. He handed them around, one to each man. The sweetness exploded on tongues used to dust and salt, a small miracle. After the meal, if it could be called that, the mood shifted again. With hunger temporarily satisfied and the card games losing their novelty, men began to talk more, to really communicate despite the language barriers. Dale pulled out his wallet and extracted a worn photograph, showing it to Klaus. A woman stood in front of a farmhouse, smiling at the camera, a young boy beside her. "My wife," Dale said, pointing at the woman, "and my son. He's 7 now. This picture's 2 years old." Klaus looked at the photograph for a long moment, then reached into his own pocket. He pulled out a small, much-folded paper and opened it carefully. The photograph inside showed a similar scene: a farm, a woman, children. "My family," Klaus said softly. "Wife, 3 children." He pointed at each face. "Nazi for 3 years." The 2 men looked at each other's families in silence, seeing their own losses reflected back. Both farmers, both husbands and fathers, both missing home so much it hurt like a physical wound. Others began sharing photographs. Johann showed a picture of his mother standing outside their home in Saxony, the house small but neat, flower boxes in the windows. Ray had a photograph of his own ranch, the house they were sitting in barely visible in the distance, cattle spread across the plains. Werner showed a picture of himself in his mechanic shop before the war, grease-stained and grinning, standing next to a Mercedes he'd just repaired. Curtis had a photograph of his brother in uniform, Army Air Corps, somewhere over Germany right now dropping bombs. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Curtis's brother might be bombing the homes of the very men sitting in this room. But instead of anger, there was only sadness, a recognition of the war's absurdity, the way it forced good men to try killing each other for reasons that seemed increasingly hollow in this dusty room. Tommy, who was barely 20 and looked younger, showed a picture of his sweetheart, a pretty girl with dark hair and a shy smile. "We're getting married when I get home," he said, his voice full of hope and longing. "Gonna have a ranch of our own someday." Johann felt a pang of envy. He had no sweetheart waiting for him, no clear future to return to. His home might not even exist anymore. The reports filtering into the camps suggested Germany was being destroyed city by city, reduced to rubble by Allied bombing. What would he return to when this war finally ended? As if reading his thoughts, Klaus put a hand on Johann's shoulder. "You are young," the older man said in German. "You will rebuild. We all will rebuild." The guards, who had been mostly silent observers, began participating more. Henderson talked about growing up in Oklahoma, about dust storms he'd seen as a child during the worst years of the Dust Bowl. "My family lost everything," he said quietly. "Farm foreclosed, had to move to the city. That's why I joined up, needed the money." Martinez shared stories of San Antonio, of his large Mexican-American family, of his grandmother who could make tortillas so thin you could see through them. The descriptions of food made everyone's empty stomachs growl, but no one told him to stop. The stories themselves were nourishment of a different kind. Music became important again on the second day. Dale's harmonica came out multiple times, playing songs that ranged from mournful to joyful. The Germans taught the Americans a drinking song called Ein Prosit, which was simple enough that even with the language barrier, everyone could join in. The Cowboys taught them Home on the Range, singing it slowly so the Germans could learn the words. The sight and sound of German prisoners and American cowboys singing together, their voices blending in the dusty air, was something none of them would forget. The songs bridged what words alone could not, carrying emotions too deep or complex for broken English or hand gestures. Werner demonstrated a coin trick, making a penny vanish and reappear. Tommy showed them a rope trick he'd learned from an old vaquero. Klaus carved a small horse from a piece of wood, his knife moving with practiced ease, and gave it to Ray as a gift. Ray accepted it with visible emotion, turning the small figure over in his calloused hands. These small exchanges of skill and kindness accumulated, building something that hadn't existed before. Trust, not complete, not without wariness, but real nonetheless. The men in this room were discovering what propaganda had tried to hide, that humanity persisted regardless of flag or uniform. On the floor between card hands, Curtis and Johann found themselves sitting side by side. Curtis pulled out a cigarette, lit it, and handed it to Johann first. They smoked in silence for a moment, then Curtis spoke. "You ever think about how crazy this all is?" Curtis asked. "I mean, out there our countries are killing each other. My brother's probably bombing your hometown right now, but in here, we're just sitting together, playing cards and sharing smokes." Johann struggled with the English, understanding the general meaning if not every word. "Is crazy," he agreed. "War is crazy, all of it crazy." "You didn't want to fight, did you?" Curtis asked, though he seemed to already know the answer. "None of you wanted this." Johann shook his head. "No, but no choice. Governments say go, you go, or they punish family." Curtis nodded slowly. "Same for most of us, I reckon, except our government asked instead of ordered, but it still felt like there wasn't much choice." They sat with that truth for a while. The machinery of war had caught them all, ground them up, and spit them out far from home. Cowboys guarding farmers who'd been forced into uniform. Young men playing cards while a storm tried to bury them, all because politicians and generals had decided their countries should be enemies. The card games on the second day became longer, more elaborate. They invented new games, hybrid creations mixing poker with German games, rules that made no sense but that everyone agreed to anyway. The matches they bet with had long since been lost or broken, so they bet with stories instead. Win a hand. Tell about your hometown. Lose a hand. Share your best memory. Ray won a hand and told about meeting his wife at a barn dance, how she'd stepped on his feet all night but he'd fallen in love anyway. Klaus lost a hand and shared the memory of his son's birth, how terrified and joyful he'd been all at once. Werner told about repairing a baron's car and being invited to dinner, feeling out of place but proud. The stories wove together, creating a tapestry of lives that were remarkably similar despite coming from different continents. These were men who valued family, honest work, simple pleasures. They wanted safety for their children, full bellies and roofs that didn't leak. The politics that had made them enemies felt increasingly absurd against these basic, universal desires. By the evening of the second day, the storm showed its first signs of weakening. The wind's howl dropped slightly in pitch. The house stopped shaking quite so violently. Men noticed and felt a mixture of relief and something else, something unexpected, sadness that this strange interlude might be ending. The third day dawned, or what passed for dawn in the continued dimness. The storm was definitely dying now, though dust still filled the air and visibility remained poor. Men stirred with the knowledge that their time together was limited. Soon the storm would break completely. Guards would reassert authority. Prisoners would return to being prisoners. The spell would break. They spent the third day differently, quieter, more contemplative. The card games continued, but without the competitive energy of before. Men sat in small groups talking through interpreters or gestures, asking questions they hadn't dared ask before. Dale asked Klaus what Germany was really like, admitting that all he knew came from propaganda newsreels. Klaus tried to describe it, the old cities and green valleys, the traditions and culture. He was honest about the darkness too, about how Hitler had risen, how fear and economic desperation had made people follow a madman. "We did not all want this," Klaus said firmly. "Many of us, we just wanted to live. But when everyone around you marches, you march too, or you disappear." Ray asked Johann what it had been like in North Africa, fighting Rommel's campaign. Johann tried to explain the heat and fear, the chaos of tank battles, the strange mixture of boredom and terror. "We hear Rommel is great general," Johann said, "but we also hear he is losing. Everything is losing now." The admission hung in the air. These German prisoners knew their country was beaten. They'd known it even before capture, watching as American industrial might overwhelmed them. Here in Texas, seeing the abundance even in captivity, they knew Germany could never win a war of production against a nation that fed its prisoners better than Germany fed its soldiers. Curtis shared his fear about what he'd do when the war ended. "Been ranching all my life," he said. "But after seeing all this, I don't know if I can go back to just tending cattle. Feels like the world got too big, you know." Werner understood, his English having improved dramatically over 3 days of immersion. "I think same thing," he said. "When I go home, if home's still there, everything will be different. I will be different." Martinez, the guard who'd been most willing to relax the rules, admitted his own confusion. "We're supposed to hate you," he said to the German prisoners. "That's what they tell us. You're Nazis, you're evil, you're trying to take over the world. But sitting here, playing cards and sharing food, you just seem like regular guys, like my uncles and cousins back in San Antonio." Henderson, still uncomfortable even on the third day, finally spoke his mind. "This doesn't change anything, though," he said, though his tone was more sad than angry. "When we leave here, you're still prisoners. We're still at war. This, whatever this is, it's just a pause." "Maybe," Ray said quietly. "But maybe pauses matter too. Maybe remembering we're all human beings, that's worth something." The storm broke completely on the afternoon of the third day. The wind died to normal levels, the dust began to settle, and for the first time in more than 70 hours, real light penetrated the shutters. Men crowded to the windows, looking out at a world transformed. Dust had piled in drifts like snow, covering everything in a uniform brown. The cattle pens were half buried, the trucks were invisible mounds, but the sky, slowly clearing, showed patches of blue. They would be able to leave soon. The main camp would send rescue teams, probably already on their way now that the storm had passed. Life would return to normal. Guards and prisoners, cowboys and captives, the boundaries would be redrawn, the rules reinstated. But for 3 days, in a ranch house in West Texas, 17 men had discovered something that no propaganda from either side could erase. They'd learned that the enemy had faces, families, hopes, and fears. They'd learned that humanity persisted even in the machinery of war. They'd learned that given time and cards and necessity, men could choose connection over conflict. The cards lay scattered on the floor where the last game had been abandoned. Ray picked up the deck slowly, holding it in his hands like something precious. "We should probably burn these," he said. "Evidence of fraternization could get us all in trouble." But he didn't burn them. Instead, he pocketed the deck, a reminder of what was possible when the storm forced men to see each other clearly. And as they prepared to open the door and face whatever came next, 17 men knew they'd carry these 3 days with them forever, a secret truth hidden in their hearts. They had been enemies. But for 3 days, playing cards while a dust storm raged, they had been something much more important. They had been human. The door opened slowly, reluctantly, as if the ranch house itself didn't want to let them go. Ray pushed against the weight of dust piled against it from outside, and gradually light, real light filtered in. The men inside, accustomed to 3 days of dim lantern glow and brown darkness, squinted against the brightness. The world that greeted them was alien. Dust had transformed the Texas landscape into something lunar, colorless, and strange. Drifts rose higher than a man's waist in places, sculpted by wind into bizarre shapes. The cattle pens were barely visible, buried under tons of fine soil. One of the trucks sat with only its roof showing above the dust line, looking like a metal island in a brown sea. But the sky, cleared now, stretched impossibly blue overhead. The sun felt like something holy after 3 days of darkness. Men stood on the porch breathing clean air, coughing up the last of the dust from their lungs, blinking at the brightness like newborns seeing the world for the first time. No one spoke at first. They simply stood there, cowboys and Germans together, looking out at the destruction and beauty with the same exhausted relief. They'd survived. All 17 of them had made it through. Then, from the distance, they heard engines. Trucks were coming, visible as dust plumes moving across the transformed landscape. The rescue teams from the main camp, sent now that the storm had broken. Reality was returning, bringing with it rules and boundaries and the resumption of normal order. Private Henderson seemed to remember himself first. He picked up his rifle, which had been leaning forgotten against the wall, and cleared his throat. "Prisoners need to, separate out. Back to proper formation." The words fell like stones. For 3 days there had been no formations, no proper separation. Just men sharing space and cards and stories. But Henderson was right. The The pause was ending. The machinery of war was grinding back into motion. Johann looked at Ray, then at Dale, then at Curtis. Their eyes met, and something passed between them that needed no translation. Gratitude. Regret. A recognition that what they'd shared was both precious and forbidden. Then, Johann moved to stand with the other German prisoners, the invisible line reforming as if it had never dissolved. The trucks arrived in a spray of dust. Officers jumped out, anxious and relieved to find everyone alive. They'd been trying to reach the ranch for 2 days, forced back by the storm's fury. Now they took in the scene, 17 men standing on the porch, looking dusty and thin, but fundamentally whole. "Everyone accounted for?" an officer asked Henderson. "Yes, sir, all present. No injuries beyond some dust in the lungs." The officer looked at the Germans standing together, then at the cowboys, his eyes sharp and assessing. "Any problems with the prisoners?" Henderson hesitated for just a fraction of a second. "No, sir. No problems." Martinez nodded confirmation. "They behaved appropriately throughout, sir." The officer seemed satisfied, though his eyes lingered on the group with something like suspicion. He'd seen men after shared hardship before. He knew that proximity created bonds, but as long as no one reported fraternization, as long as the proper forms were maintained, he could look the other way. "Get the prisoners loaded up," he ordered. "We need to get back to base camp. This mess is going to take weeks to clean up." The Germans were directed to one of the trucks. As they climbed in, Johann caught Ray's eye one more time. The cowboy nodded, a small gesture that held volumes. Johann nodded back. Then the truck's canvas cover came down, blocking the view, and they were moving, bouncing across the dust-covered landscape back toward the camp. Inside the truck, the prisoners sat in silence for a long time. Finally, Klaus spoke in German. "That was strange." "Strange," Werner agreed, "but also good, I think." "We should not speak of it," another prisoner said nervously. "If the commandant learns we fraternized with the Americans, there could be punishment." But Johann shook his head. "They won't punish us. The guards know. The cowboys know. Everyone knows what happened. But nobody will report it because—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Because something true happened there. Something that matters more than rules." The others considered this. They'd all felt it, that shift from suspicion to connection, from fear to understanding. It would be impossible to pretend those 3 days hadn't changed something fundamental in how they saw their captors, their circumstances, perhaps even the war itself. Back at the ranch, the cowboys helped the camp soldiers assess the damage. It was extensive, but not catastrophic. The cattle had survived, bunched together in the lee of a ridge. The POW buildings were intact, just buried. It would take days of hard work to dig out, but everything could be salvaged. As they worked, Ray found himself thinking about Klaus's photographs, about Werner's card tricks, about Johann's quiet dignity. These men weren't the monsters the newsreels portrayed. They were farmers and mechanics and young men who'd been caught up in something larger than themselves. Just like the cowboys. Just like everyone. Curtis noticed Ray's distraction. "You thinking about them?" he asked quietly. Ray nodded. "Hard not to. Feel like we just spent 3 days learning something important, but I'm not sure what to do with it." "Maybe just remember it," Curtis suggested. "Remember they're human. That's more than most folks at home will do." The prisoners were returned to ranch work details within a week, once the worst of the dust had been cleared, but not to the same ranch. The camp administration, perhaps sensing that something had shifted, reassigned them to different locations. Johann never saw Ray Calhoun again during the war, but he thought about him often, about all of them, about 3 days when cards and necessity had broken down walls that propaganda and politics had built, about the discovery that the enemy could laugh at the same jokes, miss their families with the same ache, fear death with the same dread. The story spread through the prisoner camps like wildfire, carried by Werner and Klaus and the others who'd been there. Other prisoners heard about the dust storm, about the cowboys who'd shared their food and water, about card games and music and conversations that revealed common humanity. Some dismissed it as fantasy. Others listened carefully, hungry for proof that Americans weren't the devils Nazi propaganda had painted them to be. For the cowboys, the story took on a different shape. Ray told it carefully to other ranchers, testing their reactions, trying to understand what it meant. Some accused him of being soft, of forgetting that Germans were the enemy. But others, men who'd worked alongside prisoners and seen their humanity up close, nodded in understanding. They'd had their own moments of recognition, smaller perhaps, but cut from the same cloth. The war ended 8 months later. By May of 1945, Germany had surrendered, Hitler was dead, and the camps began processing prisoners for repatriation. The journey home would be slow, the conditions in post-war Germany even worse than the prisoners had imagined. But they would go home, carrying with them memories of American abundance and unexpected kindness. Johann returned to Saxony to find his hometown largely intact, but his family scattered. His mother had died during the final months of the war, killed in a Soviet artillery barrage. His sister had fled west, her location unknown. The house stood empty, windows broken, rooms looted. He had nothing and no one. He stayed in Germany for 3 years, working in the rubble, helping rebuild. But the memories of Texas haunted him. The wide sky, the cattle, the taste of coffee and the sound of a harmonica. Most of all, the memory of being treated with dignity when he'd expected only contempt. In 1948, Johann made a decision that would have seemed impossible 4 years earlier. He applied to immigrate to the United States. The paperwork took 18 months. Former enemy soldiers weren't exactly welcome, even in a country as generous with immigration as post-war America. But eventually, in November of 1949, Johann stepped off a ship in New York Harbor, carrying a single suitcase and an address scrawled on a piece of paper. The address was in West Texas, Ray Calhoun's ranch. Johann had written to Ray a year earlier, a letter sent through the Red Cross since he didn't know exactly how to reach him. He'd explained who he was, reminded Ray of 3 days in a dust storm, and asked awkwardly if Ray might know of any ranch work in the area. He didn't expect a response. The letter was a gesture, a way of reaching across the gulf of former enmity toward a memory of connection. But Ray had written back. The letter was brief and practical in the way of ranchers. Work available. Bunkhouse has a free bed. Pay is fair. If you can still mend a fence, you can work here. When Johann arrived at the ranch in late November, Ray met him at the property line. The two men looked at each other for a long moment, older now, marked by the years since that storm. Then Ray stuck out his hand. "Welcome back," Ray said simply. Johann took his hand, gripping it firmly. "Thank you," he replied, his English much improved. "For everything." "You remember how to play poker?" Ray asked with a slight smile. "I remember," Johann said, smiling back. That night, in the ranch house that had sheltered them during the storm, Ray and Johann and several other ranch hands sat down to a card game. Dale was there, older and grayer, but still sharp with the cards. Curtis had moved on, married and running his own place, but Tommy had stayed, now a full ranch hand instead of a nervous kid. They dealt the cards and played like it was the most natural thing in the world, former enemy and former captor, all of it just history now. Johann wasn't the only one. Over the years, other prisoners who'd worked Texas ranches during the war found their way back. Some, like Werner, stayed in Germany but maintained correspondence with cowboys they'd befriended. Others immigrated, drawn by memories of abundance and by relationships that war had tried and failed to destroy. Klaus never returned. He died in Bavaria in 1951, but before his death, he wrote to Dale one last time. "Tell your son," the letter said, "that his father showed an enemy mercy when mercy was rare. That matters. It will always matter." Dale kept that letter until his own death 30 years later. His son found it among his father's papers and finally understood. Something about the war that history books had never quite captured. The small moments of humanity, the connections made across battle lines, the recognition that the enemy was human too. The ripple effects of 3 days in a dust storm extended further than anyone could have predicted. The story was told and retold, embellished sometimes, but fundamentally true. It became part of the oral history of the Texas Panhandle, passed down through ranching families. Cowboys told their children, the children told their children, and each time it was told, the lesson remained the same. Proximity broke down prejudice. Time revealed common humanity. Given a choice between hatred and connection, given enough hours trapped together with cards and conversation, people chose connection. Historians studying prisoner of war experiences in World War II would later note that the American camps, particularly the work details in rural areas, had an unusually low rate of post-war animosity. Former prisoners spoke positively about their treatment, many maintained friendships with their former captors, and several became advocates for American-German friendship in the rebuilding years. The Texas work camps were particularly notable for this trend. No single factor explained it. The abundance of food helped, the adherence to Geneva Convention rules mattered, but perhaps most important were the small human moments, the times when rules relaxed enough for men to see each other clearly. Moments like 3 days in a dust storm, playing cards while nature reminded everyone how small and fragile human divisions really were. The ranch house where it happened still stands, though it's changed hands several times. The current owners don't know its history, don't know that in 1944, 17 men discovered something profound within its walls. The floor where they dealt cards has been replaced, the kitchen where they rationed water has been remodeled, but the bones of the building remain, silent witness to a story that deserves remembering. Johann worked on Ray's ranch for 11 years before buying a small place of his own nearby. He married a woman from Amarillo, had 3 children, and lived to see his grandchildren. He became an American citizen in 1954, taking his oath with tears in his eyes. When asked about his war experience, he always mentioned the storm, the cards, the cowboys who'd treated him like a man when they could have treated him like an enemy. "That's when I understood America," he would say, not from books or speeches, but from Ray Calhoun dealing cards in a dust storm. "That's when I knew I wanted to come back." Ray passed away in 1973. Johann spoke at his funeral, his German accent still thick despite decades in Texas. He told the story one more time to a church full of ranchers and neighbors about a dust storm and a deck of cards in 3 days that proved something essential about human nature. He didn't have to be kind, Johann said, his voice breaking slightly. The rules said keep us separate, keep us as prisoners. But Ray understood something deeper. He understood that we were all just men trying to survive, and that understanding changed my life. The lesson of those 3 days resonates beyond one German prisoner and one Texas cowboy. It speaks to something fundamental about humanity, something we forget at our peril. Given time and proximity, given shared challenges and honest conversation, the walls between us prove surprisingly fragile. The enemy becomes a person, the other becomes familiar. And the choice between hatred and understanding tips toward understanding more often than we might expect. This matters now as much as it did in 1944. The machinery of conflict, whether war or politics or social division, depends on dehumanization. It requires us to see others as fundamentally different, as less than human, as unworthy of empathy. But 3 days in a dust storm proved how easily that machinery breaks down when you're trapped in a room together, sharing water and cards and stories. The German prisoners learned that Americans weren't soft or decadent or cruel. They were ranchers and farmers, tough and generous, who valued work and family and simple pleasures. The cowboys learned that Germans weren't all fanatical Nazis. They were men caught in history's machinery, missing home, wanting safety for their families, fundamentally the same as anyone else. And both sides learned that when forced to spend time together, to see each other clearly without the filter of propaganda, humanity asserted itself. The card games weren't just entertainment, they were democracy in action, equality around a table, everyone playing by the same rules regardless of uniform or nation. That's the real legacy of 3 days in a dust storm. Not just that enemies became friends, though they did. Not just that prejudice gave way to understanding, though it did. But that it proved something essential. We are capable of choosing connection over conflict, of recognizing our common humanity even in the midst of total war. The deck of cards Ray carried that day survived. He gave it to Johann years later, along with a photograph from after the storm, 17 dusty men standing on a porch, exhausted but alive. Johann kept both until his death in 2003. His children donated them to a small museum in Hereford, Texas, where they sit in a display case with a simple placard explaining their history. Visitors stop and look at the worn cards, the faded photograph, and read the story of a dust storm that trapped cowboys and German prisoners together. Some dismiss it as quaint, a feel-good story from simpler times, but others understand the deeper truth. 3 days, 17 men, a deck of cards and a dust storm, and a lesson that echoes across decades that humanity, given even the smallest chance, will choose connection. That the walls dividing us are never as strong as the things that unite us, that enemies can become friends when forced to see each other clearly. That's not naivety. It's not ignoring real differences or real conflicts. It's simply remembering that before we are enemies, before we are soldiers or prisoners, cowboys or Germans, we are human. And that humanity, stubborn and persistent, survives even in the machinery of war. The dust settled long ago. The storm passed into memory. But what those 17 men learned in 3 days remains. A quiet truth waiting to be remembered every time we're tempted to forget that the other side of any conflict is made of people just like us.